The Curse of the Bell Family, A Tale of the Bell Witch. Part 1, The Land of Shadows. In the early 19th century, John Bell and his family settled in Adams, Tennessee, eager to start a new life on their sprawling 320-acre farm. The Bells were prosperous and well-respected, known for their hard work and generosity. But the land they had chosen, with its fertile soil and abundant wildlife, hid a dark secret. The area was steeped in bloodshed and mystery, once inhabited by Native American tribes who had long since vanished but left behind tales of a vengeful spirit that roamed the hills. The Bell family knew nothing of the land's history when they moved into their new home. The house, a modest but sturdy log cabin, stood on the edge of a dense forest. To the Bells, it seemed like a paradise, a place where they could raise their children in peace. But almost from the moment they arrived, strange things began to happen. It started with an uneasiness that none of them could quite place. The air around the house felt heavy, oppressive, as if something unseen was watching them. The wind that rustled through the trees carried a strange whispering sound, almost like voices speaking in a language none of them could understand. At first, they dismissed it as the product of their imaginations. After all, moving to a new place could be unsettling, and the forest was full of noises. But the strange occurrences quickly escalated. The family would often find their livestock restless and agitated, their eyes wide with fear, as if they had seen something terrifying. On several occasions, John Bell discovered strange claw marks on the wooden posts of the barn, as if some creature had tried to tear its way inside. But there was no sign of any animal, no tracks or droppings, nothing to explain the damage. The most disturbing event, however, was the appearance of a mysterious figure in the woods. It was Betsy, the youngest of the Bell children, who first saw it. One afternoon, while playing near the edge of the forest, she noticed a woman standing among the trees, her face obscured by the shadows. The woman's clothes were tattered and old, and her eyes, which caught the light through the leaves, were filled with a deep, unspoken sorrow. Betsy, unnerved but curious, called out to the woman. But instead of responding, the figure turned and vanished into the trees, leaving behind only the faintest sound of rustling leaves. When Betsy told her father about the woman, John Bell dismissed it as a figment of her imagination. But as the days passed, more members of the family began to catch glimpses of the mysterious woman, always at a distance, always on the edge of the woods, watching them with eyes full of sorrow. Soon, the entire Bell family began to feel the weight of something sinister pressing down on their home. The house, once warm and inviting, now seemed cold and unwelcoming. The nights grew long and restless, filled with strange noises that no one could explain. The family was beginning to realize that they were not alone on their land. Something else was there with them, something that did not want them there. As the days turned into weeks, the Bell family found themselves living in a state of constant fear. Whatever was haunting them was growing bolder, more aggressive, and it was becoming clear that this was just the beginning. Part 2, The Haunting begins. The strangeness that had plagued the Bell family since their arrival in Adams quickly escalated into something far more terrifying. It began with the scratching. At first, it was faint, just a soft, persistent noise that seemed to come from within the walls of the house. But as the days passed, the scratching grew louder, more insistent, as if something was trying to claw its way out. The sound was most intense at night, when the family was trying to sleep. The scratching would start in one corner of the room and slowly move across the walls, as if whatever was causing it was crawling inside the house. The noise was unnerving, but despite tearing open the walls to investigate, John Bell found nothing. There were no rats, no signs of any animals, just the empty, dusty spaces between the logs. As disturbing as the scratching was, it was only the beginning. Soon, the family began to hear faint whispers in the dead of night. The voices were soft at first, barely audible, but as they strained to listen, they could make out fragments of words. The voices spoke in a strange, guttural tone, and although the language was foreign, the malice in the words was unmistakable. The whispers seemed to come from all around them, surrounding the family as they huddled together in fear. One night, as the whispers grew louder, John Bell thought he could hear his own name being spoken. John. Bell, the voice was slow, deliberate, and filled with a hatred that sent chills down his spine. He sat up in bed, his heart pounding, but the voice only grew louder. John. Bell, it was as if the very walls of the house were calling to him, taunting him. Terrified, John lit a candle and searched the house, but found nothing. The whispers stopped as suddenly as they had begun, leaving only an eerie silence in their wake. The rest of the family had heard the voice too, and they all looked to John for answers. But there were no answers to give, only more questions and a growing sense of dread. The Bell family was living in a waking nightmare, and there was no escape. The once peaceful house had become a place of terror, where every creak of the floorboards, every rustle of the wind, seemed to carry with it the threat of something dark and malevolent. The family was on edge, exhausted from sleepless nights and the constant fear that had settled over them like a thick, suffocating fog. As the haunting grew more intense, the entity began to make its presence known in more tangible ways. Objects would move on their own, chairs would slide across the floor, doors would slam shut with no one near them, and utensils would fly off the kitchen table as if thrown by invisible hands. The children would wake up screaming in the middle of the night, claiming they had been pinched, slapped, or even choked by something they couldn't see. The youngest daughter, Betsy, seemed to be the primary target of the entity's wrath. She would often wake up with bruises and welts on her body, her hair tangled and yanked out in clumps. The family was at a loss, unable to protect her from the unseen force that tormented her night after night. Betsy's once bright and cheerful demeanor began to fade, replaced by a constant fear and anxiety that weighed heavily on her small frame. The Bell family tried to carry on with their lives, but the haunting was relentless. It was as if the entity was feeding off their fear, growing stronger with each passing day. The house had become a prison, and the family was trapped, with no hope of escape. As the days turned into weeks, the Bell family realized that they were facing something far beyond their understanding, something ancient and evil that had taken root in their home. And it was becoming clear that the entity had no intention of leaving. Part 3: The Witch's Wrath. The situation for the Bell family became more dire with each passing day. The entity, now widely referred to as the Bell Witch by those who had heard of the family's plight, grew bolder and more violent. It seemed to take a particular pleasure in tormenting John Bell and his youngest daughter, Betsy. The malevolent spirit's attacks became more frequent and more vicious, leaving the family in a constant state of fear. The local community, initially skeptical of the Bell's claims, began to take notice as more people experienced the strange phenomena firsthand. Visitors to the Bell home would often hear the same disembodied voices, feel an icy chill in the air, or witness objects moving of their own accord. The once quiet and isolated farmstead had become the talk of the town, with neighbors whispering about the curse that had befallen the Bell family. John Bell, once a strong and capable man, found himself slowly wasting away. The entity seemed to focus much of its rage on him, taunting him with threats and predictions of his death. John began to suffer from strange fits and seizures, and his body grew weak and frail. The family's attempts to seek help from the church were in vain. Prayers and blessings did nothing to stop the relentless torment. Betsy's suffering was even more intense. The witch seemed to have a special hatred for the young girl, subjecting her to physical and psychological torment. Betsy would often be found crying in the corner of her room, clutching at her bruised and battered limbs. The entity's attacks were not limited to nighttime. Betsy would be slapped, pinched, and scratched even in broad daylight, with witnesses often present. In a particularly terrifying incident, Betsy was playing with some friends outside when she was suddenly lifted off the ground and thrown several feet across the yard by an invisible force. The children screamed in terror as Betsy lay on the ground, dazed and bruised, unable to comprehend what had just happened. The other children ran home to tell their parents, and soon the entire community was abuzz with the latest tale of the Bell Witch's cruelty. Despite the torment, the Bell family was determined to stay in their home. John Bell believed that abandoning the farm would only anger the spirit further, and so they remained, enduring the witch's wrath as best they could. But as the months passed, it became clear that the entity was not going to stop until it had achieved its goal, whatever that might be. The haunting reached its peak one cold winter night. The family was gathered in the living room, huddled together in front of the fire, when suddenly the room was filled with the sound of heavy footsteps. The footsteps grew louder and closer, echoing through the house, as if someone or something was pacing back and forth. The family watched in horror as the furniture began to shake, and the fire in the hearth flickered and nearly went out. Then, without warning, the entity began to speak. Its voice was low and guttural, filled with malice and hatred. "I am the witch of this land," it growled. "You have trespassed on my domain, and now you will pay the price. None of you will escape my wrath. I will torment you until your dying breath." The voice was accompanied by a cold wind that swept through the room, extinguishing the fire and plunging the house into darkness. The family could feel the witch's presence all around them, pressing down on them like a physical weight. They were powerless to resist, trapped in their own home by a force they could not see or fight. For John Bell, the entity's threats became a grim reality. His health continued to deteriorate, and soon he was bedridden, too weak to move. The witch continued to taunt him, whispering in his ear, reminding him that his time was running out. The family watched helplessly as the man who had once been their protector and provider slowly withered away, his life force drained by the malevolent spirit. The Bell Witch's wrath was unrelenting, and it was clear that the entity would not rest until it had claimed its victims. The family was living in a nightmare from which there seemed to be no escape, and they could only wonder what horrors the witch had in store for them next. Part 4: A Town in Fear. As news of the Bell Witch's attack spread throughout Adams, Tennessee, fear gripped the town. The once close-knit community was now divided between those who believed the Bells were cursed and those who thought the family was the victim of a cruel hoax or mass hysteria. But even the skeptics found it hard to dismiss the growing number of strange occurrences reported by others who had encountered the entity. Some townsfolk claimed to have seen ghostly apparitions near the Bell farm, while others spoke of hearing eerie, disembodied voices in the woods surrounding the property. Farmers reported that their crops were failing, and livestock became sick or died under mysterious circumstances. A pall of dread hung over the entire area, as if the land itself had become tainted by the witch's malevolence. The Bell Witch became a topic of heated discussion at every gathering. The local church held special prayer meetings, beseeching God to protect the community from the dark force that had descended upon them. But despite their prayers, the haunting continued, growing more intense with each passing day. One of the most terrifying incidents occurred when a group of local men, determined to prove that the Bell Witch was a figment of the family's imagination, decided to spend the night at the Bell farm. Armed with rifles and lanterns, they set up camp outside the house, confident that they could outwit whatever was terrorizing the family. At first, the night was uneventful, and the men began to relax, laughing and joking about the so-called witch that had the town in such an uproar. But as midnight approached, a heavy silence fell over the group. The air grew cold, and a strange mist began to rise from the ground, enveloping them in a thick, suffocating fog. Suddenly, the men heard a low, rumbling growl coming from the darkness. They scrambled to their feet, their lanterns flickering as the fog closed in around them. The growl grew louder, more menacing, and was soon joined by the sound of heavy footsteps that seemed to circle them, growing closer and closer. Panic set in as the men realized that whatever was out there was not human. They fired their rifles into the fog, but the bullets seemed to have no effect. The footsteps continued, now accompanied by a deep, mocking laughter that echoed through the night. The men could feel something brushing against them in the dark, cold fingers that tugged at their clothes and hair. In a frenzy of fear, the men fled the farm, abandoning their weapons and running blindly through the fog. When they finally reached the safety of the town, they were trembling and pale, unable to explain what had happened to them. The experience left them shaken, and they refused to return to the Bell farm. The incident only fueled the town's fear of the Bell Witch. People began to avoid the Bell family, terrified that the curse might spread to them. The once friendly neighbors now kept their distance, whispering behind closed doors about the fate that had befallen the Bells. The Bell family, already isolated by the haunting, found themselves even more alone. The townsfolk's fear and suspicion only added to their torment, and they were left to face the witch's wrath with no one to turn to for help. John Bell's health continued to decline, and Betsy became more withdrawn, her spirit crushed by the relentless attacks. The Bell Witch had not only cursed the family but had cast a shadow over the entire town of Adams, and as the winter dragged on, The cold and fear seemed to seep into every corner of the community, leaving them all wondering who or what might be next to fall victim to the witch's curse. Part 5: The Mysterious Visitor. In the midst of their torment, the Bell family received an unexpected visitor. A traveler named Joshua Gardner, a close friend of the family, arrived at the Bell farm with a determined look in his eyes. Gardner had heard the stories of the Bell Witch and had come to see for himself what was happening. He was particularly concerned for Betsy, whom he had known since she was a child. Gardner was a rational man, not given to flights of fancy, and he believed that there had to be a logical explanation for the events that were plaguing the Bell family. He offered to stay with them for a time, hoping that his presence might help calm the situation. John Bell, desperate for any relief, gratefully accepted the offer. The first few days of Gardner's stay were uneventful, and the family began to hope that the worst was over. But their hopes were soon dashed. One evening, as they were sitting down to dinner, the room was suddenly filled with a deafening roar. The dishes on the table rattled, and the windows shook as if a great storm had descended upon them. The roar grew louder, filling the house with an almost unbearable noise. Then, just as suddenly as it had begun, the noise stopped. The family sat in stunned silence, their ears ringing from the intensity of the sound. Gardner, though shaken, insisted that there had to be a rational explanation. But the look in his eyes betrayed his growing doubt. That night, Gardner experienced the full force of the Bell Witch's wrath. As he lay in bed, trying to make sense of what had happened, he felt a cold, clammy hand grip his ankle. Startled, he sat up, but there was no one there. The room was dark and still, the only sound the soft breathing of the other family members. But the grip on his ankle tightened, and Gardner felt himself being pulled from the bed. He tried to resist, but the unseen force was too strong. He was dragged across the floor, his hands scrambling to find something to hold on to. The force pulled him into the hallway, where he was slammed against the wall with a bone-jarring impact. Gardner gasped for breath, his body aching from the force of the blow. But the entity was not finished with him. It lifted him off the ground and threw him down the stairs, his body tumbling helplessly until he landed in a heap at the bottom. The fall knocked the wind out of him, and he lay there, dazed and disoriented. The family rushed to his aid, but Gardner waved them off, insisting that he was fine. But his face was pale, and his hands trembled as he tried to stand. He could feel the cold eyes of the witch watching him, mocking him for his disbelief. The next morning, Gardner announced that he was leaving. He could not explain what had happened to him, but he knew that he was no match for the force that had taken hold of the Bell farm. He urged the family to leave as well, but John Bell shook his head. This was their home, and they could not abandon it. Gardner left the Bell farm that day, but the memory of what he had experienced stayed with him for the rest of his life. He never spoke of it to anyone, but the fear in his eyes told the story. The Bell family was once again alone, left to face the witch's wrath with no one to help them. The entity seemed to take pleasure in their suffering, growing stronger and more malevolent with each passing day. The family's hope was dwindling, and they could only pray that the end was near. But the Bell Witch had no intention of letting them go so easily. The curse that had befallen the family was far from over, and the darkest days were yet to come. Part 6: A Desperate Plea. The Bell family's situation grew more desperate with each passing day. The entity that tormented them showed no signs of relenting, and the attacks became more frequent and more violent. John Bell's health continued to decline, and Betsy was a shadow of her former self, her once vibrant spirit crushed by the relentless torment. In a last-ditch effort to rid themselves of the curse, the family sought the help of a local minister. Reverend James Johnston was a man of deep faith and a respected figure in the community. When he heard of the Bell family's plight, he agreed to visit the farm and see what he could do. The Reverend arrived at the Bell home one cold winter's day, his Bible in hand. He was greeted by the weary and haggard faces of the Bell family, who had long since lost hope of finding peace. But the Reverend was undeterred. He believed that the power of God could drive out any evil, no matter how strong. Johnston began by praying over the house, sprinkling holy water in each room and reciting passages from the Bible. The family watched anxiously as the Reverend moved from room to room, his voice strong and confident. For a moment, it seemed as if the air in the house grew lighter, the oppressive atmosphere lifting slightly. But as the Reverend approached Betsy's room, the temperature in the house plummeted. The once warm and cozy cabin was now as cold as a tomb, and the air grew thick with an unearthly chill. The Reverend hesitated for a moment, sensing the malevolent presence that had taken hold of the room. But he steeled himself and entered, determined to confront the evil head-on. As soon as he crossed the threshold, the door slammed shut behind him with a deafening crash. The family rushed to open it, but it was as if the door was sealed by an invisible force. The sound of the Reverend's voice could be heard from within, praying fervently, but it was soon drowned out by a low, menacing growl that seemed to come from the very walls of the house. The growl grew louder, more intense, until it became a deafening roar. The walls of the cabin shook, and the floorboards creaked under the strain. The family could do nothing but listen in terror as the Reverend continued to pray, his voice now barely audible over the cacophony of noise. Then, suddenly, the roar stopped. The silence that followed was almost more terrifying than the noise. The family held their breath, waiting for some sign of what had happened to the Reverend. After what felt like an eternity, the door to Betsy's room creaked open. The Reverend emerged, his face pale and his eyes wide with fear. His hands trembled as he clutched his Bible, and he looked as if he had aged 10 years in the short time he had been in the room. Without a word, Reverend Johnston left the house. The family watched as he hurried down the path, his footsteps quick and unsteady. He did not look back, and they knew that he would not return. The Reverend's departure left the family more hopeless than ever. If even a man of God could not drive out the entity, what hope did they have? The Bell Witch had proven to be more powerful than anything they had ever imagined, and it seemed that there was no escaping her wrath. The winter dragged on, each day blending into the next as the family struggled to survive. The once vibrant and lively Bell Farm was now a place of darkness and despair, where laughter and joy had long since been replaced by fear and sorrow. And still, the witch's presence lingered, her malevolent spirit growing stronger with each passing day. The Bell family knew that their time was running out, but they could only wait in dread for what was to come. Part 7: The Witch's Prophecy. The Bell Witch's torment had taken a heavy toll on the family, but the entity was far from finished. One evening, as the family gathered around the fireplace, the familiar cold chill swept through the room. The flames flickered and dimmed, casting long, eerie shadows on the walls. A voice, deep and guttural, filled the room. "I have a message for you, John Bell," the voice growled. The family froze, their hearts pounding in their chests. The voice continued, dripping with malice. "Your time is near, John. You will not live to see the end of the year." John Bell's face went pale, and he felt a cold sweat break out on his forehead. The entity's words were a direct threat, a prophecy of his death. The family looked at him in horror, but John could only stare into the flickering flames, his mind racing with fear and despair. The witch's voice continued, mocking and taunting. "I have cursed you, John Bell. I will see you dead, and there is nothing you can do to stop it. Your suffering has only just begun." The voice faded away, leaving behind an oppressive silence. The family sat in stunned disbelief, the weight of the witch's words pressing down on them like a heavy shroud. John Bell, once a strong and capable man, now looked like a shadow of his former self. The witch's curse had drained the life from him, and now she had foretold his death. The days that followed were filled with a sense of impending doom. John Bell's health, already fragile, declined rapidly. He was plagued by fits and seizures, his body racked with pain. The entity continued to torment him, whispering in his ear, reminding him of the prophecy. The family was powerless to stop the witch's attacks. Betsy, too, continued to suffer, her nights filled with terror as the entity pinched and slapped her, leaving her bruised and battered. The other children tried to avoid the house as much as possible, spending their days outside or with friends, but the fear of the witch's presence was always with them. As the days passed, John Bell grew weaker and weaker. He could no longer leave his bed, and even speaking became a struggle. The family watched helplessly as the man who had once been their protector and provider withered away, his life force drained by the malevolent spirit that had taken hold of their home. The witch's prophecy hung over the family like a dark cloud, and they could only wait in dread for the day when it would come true. Part 8: The Final Days. The winter had been long and brutal, and by the time spring arrived, John Bell was a shell of his former self. The once strong and capable man was now bedridden, his body ravaged by the witch's curse. His once clear eyes were now dull and lifeless, and his skin was pale and gaunt. The family knew that the end was near, but they were powerless to stop it. The Bell Witch's torment continued unabated. The entity seemed to take pleasure in watching John Bell suffer, taunting him with whispered threats and cruel laughter. The family could only watch in helpless horror as the witch's prophecy slowly came to pass. One morning, John Bell was found unconscious in his bed, his breathing shallow and labored. The family rushed to his side, but it was clear that he was slipping away. The doctor was called, but there was little he could do. John Bell's body was too weak, too far gone to be saved. As the family gathered around his bedside, the witch's voice filled the room once again. "I told you, John Bell," the voice hissed. "Your time is up. You will die, and there is nothing you can do to stop it." The family watched in horror as John Bell's body convulsed, his breathing growing more and more labored. The doctor administered a dose of medicine to ease his pain, but it was too late. The witch's curse had done its work, and John Bell's life was slipping away. As the end drew near, the witch's presence became more palpable. The air in the room grew thick and heavy, and the temperature dropped to a bone-chilling cold. The family could feel the entity's malevolent gaze upon them, watching as John Bell took his final breaths. In his last moments, John Bell's eyes flickered open. He looked around at his family, his gaze filled with a deep sorrow. But there was something else in his eyes as well, a hint of defiance, a refusal to let the witch have the final word. With his last breath, John Bell whispered a single word: "No." And then he was gone. The family stood in stunned silence, unable to comprehend what had just happened. The witch had foretold his death, and now it had come to pass. The patriarch of the Bell family was dead, and the witch had claimed her victory. But even in death, John Bell's defiance echoed through the house. The witch's presence seemed to waver, as if she had been momentarily taken aback by his final act of resistance. The oppressive atmosphere that had plagued the house for so long seemed to lift, if only slightly. The family buried John Bell in a quiet ceremony, attended by a few close friends and neighbors. The townsfolk, once so afraid of the witch's curse, now looked upon the Bell family with a mixture of pity and fear. They had survived the witch's wrath, but at a terrible cost. As they stood by John Bell's grave, the family knew that their ordeal was not over. The witch's presence still lingered, and there was no telling what she might do next. But for now, they had a brief respite, a moment of peace in the midst of the storm. And they could only hope that it would last. Part 9: A Haunting Legacy. With John Bell's death, the Bell Witch's torment seemed to lessen, but it was far from over. The entity continued to make its presence known, albeit less frequently. The family's nights were still filled with strange noises and the occasional slap or pinch, but the intense violence that had marked the previous months had abated. The family tried to return to some semblance of normalcy, but the haunting had left deep scars. Betsy, in particular, was deeply affected by the events. The young girl, once full of life and energy, was now withdrawn and fearful. The witch's attacks had left her traumatized, and it was clear that she would never be the same. The town of Adams was also changed by the events at the Bell farm. The story of the Bell Witch spread far and wide, drawing the curious and the skeptical alike. Some came to offer help, others to see if the tales were true, but all left with a sense of unease. The Bell Witch had become a part of the town's history, a dark chapter that would not be easily forgotten. As the years passed, the Bell family continued to live on the farm, but the memory of the witch's torment never left them. They spoke little of what had happened, but the shadow of those dark days hung over them like a pall. Betsy eventually married, but her marriage was marked by tragedy. Her husband, Joshua Gardner, the same man who had once tried to help the family, was found dead under mysterious circumstances just a few years after their wedding. Some whispered that the witch had not forgotten Betsy, that her curse had followed the girl into her new life. The Bell family's story became the stuff of legend, passed down from generation to generation. The tale of the Bell Witch, the entity that had tormented an entire family and foretold the death of its patriarch, was told and retold, each time growing more terrifying. But for those who had lived through it, the story was all too real. The Bell Witch had left a lasting mark on the family, the town, and all who had heard the tale. And though the entity's presence eventually faded, the memory of those dark days would never be forgotten. Even now, over a century later, the story of the Bell Witch endures. The Bell Farm still stands, a silent witness to the horrors that once took place there. Visitors still come, hoping to catch a glimpse of the ghostly figure that is said to haunt the property. Some claim to hear strange noises, feel cold chills, or see fleeting shadows out of the corner of their eye. But whether the Bell Witch is still there, or whether she has finally found peace, no one can say for sure. What is certain is that the legacy of the Bell Witch lives on, a haunting reminder of the dark forces that can sometimes take hold of our lives and refuse to let go. And so, the story of the Bell Witch comes to a close, but the echoes of her presence continue to linger, a chilling reminder that some spirits never truly rest,